The hotel room was silent except for the sound of Marc Bergeron's breathing. Shallow, rapid. The kind of breathing that comes when the mind cannot process what the eyes are seeing. He sat on the floor in the corner, his back pressed against the wall, his wedding suit wrinkled and stained. The phone was in his hand, but he couldn't remember picking it up, couldn't remember dialing. The operator's voice came through distant and tinny, asking him to state his emergency, asking him if he was still there, asking him to please respond. His eyes were fixed on the bed, on the white sheets, on the red that bloomed across them like flowers opening in the morning, on his wife, on Samira, on the woman he'd married 8 hours ago, on the woman who wasn't moving. He tried to speak. His mouth opened. No sound came out. The operator's voice grew more insistent. "Sir, are you there? Sir, what is your location? Sir, I'm sending help." Mark's hand fell to his side. The phone clattered against the hardwood floor. He stared at Samira's face, turned slightly toward him, her eyes half open, her expression almost peaceful. Almost. And in that moment, as sirens began to wail somewhere in the distance, he realized he didn't know her at all. 3 months earlier, Samira El-Fassi had been standing in the narrow kitchen of her apartment in the plateau, waiting for water to boil. It was a Tuesday morning in late August, and the light coming through the window was the particular gold that only existed in Montreal at the end of summer. She wore a pale blue robe, her dark hair loose and damp from the shower, and she moved through her small space with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to be comfortable alone. The apartment wasn't much. A studio with high ceilings and old radiators that clanked in winter, bookshelves crammed with novels in French and Arabic, a worn prayer rug rolled carefully in the corner. But it was hers. She'd built this life carefully, piece by piece, in the 5 years since she'd arrived in Canada. The kettle whistled. She poured mint tea into a glass cup, added sugar, stirred slowly. On the counter, her phone buzzed. A message from her mother in Casablanca, the usual questions. Are you eating enough? Are you safe? Have you met anyone? Samira typed back the usual answers. Yes, Mama. Yes, not yet. The lie came easily now. She'd been telling it for so long it felt like truth. Samira worked as a translator at a small immigration law firm downtown. She had a gift for languages, could move fluidly between Arabic, French, and English, could capture not just words but meaning, tone, the spaces between what people said and what they meant. Her clients trusted her. Her boss, a sharp-eyed woman named Dominique, relied on her. But Samira kept her distance. She was friendly, but never familiar. Professional, but never personal. She ate lunch alone. Declined invitations to after-work drinks. When colleagues asked about her life, her family, her past, she smiled and deflected. There were things about her that no one knew. Things she intended to keep that way. It was mid-September when Marc Bergeron walked into the law office with an elderly Algerian man who spoke almost no French. Marc was representing the man in a housing dispute, and Dominique had called Samira in to translate. Marc was tall, broad-shouldered, with a kind of face that looked kind even in repose. He had light brown hair that curled slightly at the edges, a neat beard going gray at the chin, and blue eyes that seemed genuinely interested in what people had to say. He shook Samira's hand and thanked her in careful, accented Arabic. She smiled politely and sat down. The meeting lasted an hour. Samira translated the old man's grievances, his fears, his desperation. Marc listened intently, taking notes, asking thoughtful questions. When it was over, he thanked her again. She nodded and turned to leave. But at the door, he spoke. "Excuse me." She paused. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to be forward, but there's a Moroccan cafe near here. Argana. Have you been?" She turned. He looked slightly embarrassed. "I only asked because the owner's been teaching me Arabic, and I thought maybe you'd, I don't know, want to grab tea sometime, if you're ever free. No pressure." Samira studied him. She'd developed an instinct for men over the years. Could usually tell within seconds what they wanted, what they were hiding, but Marc seemed transparent, almost disarmingly so. She should have said no. She meant to say no. Instead, she heard herself say, "Thursday, 4 o'clock." Their first meeting at Argana was awkward in the way first meetings often are. Marc was nervous, talked too much about his work, his projects, the bridge renovation he was overseeing in Laval. Samira sipped her tea and listened. She volunteered little. But when he asked her a direct question, "How long have you been in Montreal?" she answered honestly, 5 years. She'd come for work, for a fresh start. She loved the city. The winters were hard, but she'd adjusted. When he asked about her family, she said they were still in Morocco. She missed them. She called often. All true, all incomplete. As they talked, something shifted. Mark stopped performing. He told her about his divorce, finalized a year earlier, how his ex-wife had left him for someone she'd met at a yoga retreat, how he'd felt humiliated, then angry, then just tired, how he'd thrown himself into work and realized one day that he was lonely. Samira felt something soften in her chest. She knew loneliness, knew how it could hollow you out. When they left the cafe, the sun was setting, and Mark asked if he could see her again. She said yes. Over the following weeks, they fell into a pattern. Coffee on Sundays, walks along the canal, a movie at the old Repertory Cinema on Park Avenue. Mark was patient. He didn't push, didn't ask invasive questions, didn't try to rush anything physical. Samira found herself relaxing in his presence, laughing at his terrible jokes, looking forward to his texts. He was stable, decent, safe, everything her life before had not been. But she kept her walls up. When he suggested meeting her friends, she said she didn't have many. When he asked to see her apartment, she deflected. When he invited her to meet his sister Claire for dinner, she hesitated so long he withdrew the offer. He noticed. Of course he noticed. One night in late October, they were sitting in his car outside her building. Rain drummed against the windshield. He turned to her. "Samira, I need to ask you something." She stiffened. "Are you seeing someone else?" She blinked. "What? No." "Then why does it feel like you're always 1 foot out the door?" The question hung between them. She could have lied, could have reassured him. Instead, she said, "I've been hurt before, badly, and I'm trying not to be hurt again." He reached for her hand. "I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to know you." She looked at him, at his open, honest face, at the vulnerability in his eyes, and she made a choice. She leaned over and kissed him, softly at first, then deeper. When she pulled back, she whispered, "I'm trying." By December, they were inseparable. Mark had a key to her apartment. They spent weekends together, cooking elaborate meals, watching old films, talking until late into the night. Samira let him in, piece by piece. She showed him her books, her photographs, the small rituals that shaped her days. But there were still gaps, subjects she avoided, questions she deflected. When he asked about visiting Morocco together, maybe meeting her family, she became anxious. She said her mother was traditional. It would be complicated, maybe after they were more serious. Mark didn't press. He loved her. He believed in taking things slow. On a Friday evening in mid-April, Mark took Samira to Mont Royal. They hiked to the lookout as the sun set over the city. The sky was streaked pink and gold. He stopped, turned to her, and dropped to one knee. He didn't have a ring. He'd wanted to wait, to choose one together, but he couldn't wait anymore. "Samira, I know we haven't been together that long. I know there are things about you I still don't know, but I love you. I love who you are with me. I love how you make me want to be better. Will you marry me?" She stared at him. For a moment, he thought she might run. Then tears filled her eyes. She nodded, whispered yes. He stood and wrapped her in his arms, and she clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a tilting world. The wedding was planned for late June. Small, intimate, just 20 guests. Mark's family, a few close friends, colleagues from Samira's office. She insisted they keep it simple. No elaborate reception, no destination honeymoon. Just a quiet ceremony at the courthouse, followed by dinner at a private room in a French bistro in Old Montreal. Mark agreed to everything. He was happy. His sister Claire was less enthusiastic. She pulled him aside 2 weeks before the wedding. "Do you really know her, Mark?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, have you met her family? Have you seen where she grew up? Do you know anything about her life before Montreal? She's private. She's been through a lot. You don't even know what she's been through." "That's my point," Mark bristled. "I know enough. I know she's kind. I know she's honest with me." Claire sighed. "I hope you're right." The wedding day was perfect. June 21st, the longest day of the year. Samira wore a white caftan embroidered with silver thread. Her hair swept up, a simple silver necklace at her throat. She looked radiant. Mark wore a charcoal suit, couldn't stop smiling. The ceremony was brief. They exchanged vows, slipped rings onto each other's fingers, kissed as their guests applauded. At the reception, Samira seemed happy. She laughed, danced with Mark, accepted congratulations graciously. But midway through dinner, she stood by the window, looking out at the cobblestone street below. Mark joined her. "Everything okay?" She nodded. But her eyes were fixed on something outside. Mark followed her gaze. Across the street, partially hidden in the shadow of a doorway, a man stood watching. Tall, dark hair, leather jacket. Their eyes met through the glass. The man didn't move, didn't look away. Samira's hand tightened on her wine glass. "Samira?" Mark touched her shoulder. She flinched, turned. "Sorry, I thought I saw someone." "Who?" She shook her head, forced a smile. "No one, just tired." But when Mark looked back at the window, the man was gone. And Samira's smile didn't reach her eyes. They checked into the Hotel Le Saint-Sulpice just after 10 that evening. There was a boutique hotel tucked into a quiet corner of old Montreal, all exposed brick and soft lighting, the kind of place that felt both historic and intimate. Mark had reserved the honeymoon suite months ago, wanting everything to be perfect. The concierge congratulated them warmly, handed over the key cards, and wished them a beautiful night. Samira smiled and thanked him, but her hand trembled slightly as she took the card. Mark noticed. He'd been noticing things all evening. The way she kept glancing over her shoulder during dinner. The way she'd barely touched her food. The way she'd excused herself 3 times to check her phone. When he'd asked if something was wrong, she'd blamed wedding nerves, exhaustion, too much champagne. He'd wanted to believe her. The suite was beautiful. Hardwood floors, a 4-poster bed draped in white linens, French doors that opened onto a small balcony overlooking the old city. A bottle of champagne sat chilling in a silver bucket, 2 crystal flutes beside it, rose petals scattered across the bedspread. Mark set down their overnight bags and turned to Samira. She stood in the center of the room, still in her caftan, looking around as if she were cataloging escape routes. He crossed to her, took her hands. "Hey," he said softly, "we made it." She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark, unreadable. "We did." He kissed her forehead. "I know today was overwhelming. We don't have to do anything tonight. We can just sleep if you want." Something flickered across her face. Relief, maybe, or guilt. "Let's have some champagne first," she said. "Celebrate properly." Mark popped the cork, poured 2 glasses. They sat on the edge of the bed and he raised his glass. "To my wife." The word felt strange and wonderful in his mouth. Wife. Samira clinked her glass against his, but didn't repeat the toast. They drank in silence. The champagne was excellent, dry and cold. Mark felt the tension of the day beginning to dissolve. He loosened his tie, kicked off his shoes. Samira remained perfectly still, glass in hand, staring at nothing. "Talk to me," Mark said. "What's going on in that head of yours?" She turned to him. For a moment, he thought she might finally tell him whatever she'd been holding back. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him. Hard, urgent, almost desperate. He responded, surprised but willing, his hands moving to her waist. But when he tried to deepen the kiss, she pulled back. "I need to use the bathroom," she said abruptly, standing. "I'll just be a minute." She disappeared into the marble bathroom, closing the door behind her. Mark heard the water run. He refilled their glasses, walked to the balcony doors, looked out at the city. The streets below were mostly empty, just a few late-night wanderers, the glow of street lamps reflecting off rain-slicked cobblestones. It had started to drizzle. He thought about the man he'd seen outside the restaurant, the man Samira had been watching. He'd asked her about it in the car on the way to the hotel. She'd said it was nothing, a misunderstanding, someone who looked like someone she used to know, but her voice had been too tight, her answer too quick. Mark wanted to trust her. He did trust her, but something felt wrong. He finished his champagne and checked his watch. Samira had been in the bathroom for 15 minutes. When she finally emerged, her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, her hair down. She'd changed into a simple white nightgown. She looked younger, more vulnerable. "Sorry," she said. "I needed a moment." Mark smiled. "It's okay. Come here." She climbed onto the bed, and he wrapped his arms around her. They lay there in the dim light, her head on his chest, his fingers running through her hair. He could feel her heartbeat. Fast. Too fast. "Samira, whatever you're worried about, we can handle it together." "You know that, Ray." She didn't answer. After a while, her breathing slowed. Mark thought she'd fallen asleep. He let himself relax, closed his eyes, let the exhaustion of the day pull him under. He woke to the sound of buzzing, his phone vibrating on the nightstand. He reached for it groggily, squinting at the screen. A notification from his credit card company, a charge from earlier that evening. He dismissed it, glanced at the time, 2:37 in the morning. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the city through the balcony doors. He turned to Samira. The bed beside him was empty. He sat up, suddenly alert. "Samira?" No answer. The bathroom door was open, the light off. He swung his legs out of bed, stood. His heart was starting to race. "Samira, where are you?" He checked the bathroom. Empty. The closet. Their bags were still there, but her phone wasn't on the nightstand where she'd left it. He crossed to the suite door. It was unlocked. She'd left. In the middle of the night, on their wedding night. Without a word, Mark grabbed his jacket, pulled on his shoes, fumbled with his phone as he stumbled into the hallway. He tried calling her. It went straight to voicemail. He took the stairs, too impatient to wait for the elevator, nearly tripping in his haste. The lobby was deserted except for a night clerk reading behind the desk. "Did you see a woman come through here? Dark hair, white nightgown, maybe a coat?" The clerk looked up, shook his head. "Sorry, no one's come down in the past hour." Mark pushed through the front doors into the street. The rain had stopped, but the pavement was still wet, reflecting the amber glow of streetlights. He looked left, then right. Nothing. He started walking, then jogging, his breath coming in short bursts. Where would she go? Why would she leave? Had something happened? Was she in danger? His mind spun through possibilities, each worse than the last. He turned the corner onto Rue St. Paul, scanning the empty sidewalks, the closed shops. Then he saw her. 2 blocks ahead, standing in the center of the small square near the Notre Dame Basilica. She wasn't alone. The man from the restaurant was there. The same tall figure, same leather jacket. They stood facing each other, and even from a distance, Mark could see the tension in their postures. Samira's arms were crossed. The man was gesturing sharply, his voice rising. Mark couldn't hear the words, but the language was Arabic, harsh, angry. He started running. His footsteps echoed off the buildings. Samira turned, saw him. Her face went white. The man followed her gaze, saw Mark approaching. He said something quick and sharp to Samira, something that made her flinch. Then he looked at Mark with an expression of pure contempt and walked away, disappearing into a side street before Mark could reach them. Mark stopped in front of Samira, breathing hard. She stood there in her nightgown and a thin coat she must have grabbed from the room, shivering. Her feet were bare. She'd run out without shoes. "What the hell is going on?" Mark demanded. "Who was that?" Samira's eyes filled with tears. "Mark, please, not here, not here." "Samira, you left our hotel room in the middle of the night, on our wedding night, to meet some men in the street. You're going to tell me what's happening, right now." She wrapped her arms around herself. "It's complicated, then uncomplicated." She looked away. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "His name is Karim. He's from Morocco, from my past." "What does he want?" "He wants me to come back. He thinks I owe him something." Mark felt ice forming in his chest. "Owe him what, Samira? Were you involved with this man?" "No. God, no. It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" She looked at him then, and he saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Not just fear, guilt. Deep, corrosive guilt. "I can't tell you here," she said. "Please, let's go back to the hotel. I'll explain everything, I promise." Mark wanted to demand answers now, wanted to shake the truth out of her. But she looked so small, so broken, standing there barefoot in the empty square. He pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You're going to tell me everything," he said quietly. "No more secrets." She nodded. "No more secrets." They walked back to the hotel in silence. The night clerk gave them a curious look as they passed through the lobby, Samira's bare feet leaving faint wet prints on the marble floor. In the elevator, Mark stared at the numbers climbing. Samira stared at the floor. When they reached the suite, Mark poured himself a glass of water and waited. Samira sat on the edge of the bed, his jacket still around her shoulders. She looked at her hands, took a breath. "I haven't been completely honest with you," she began. Mark said nothing. "My life before Montreal, the reason I came to Canada. I told you I wanted a fresh start, and that's true. But there's more." She paused. He waited. "I was married before." The words hit him like a physical blow. "What?" "In Morocco, I was married. His name was Youssef, Karim's older brother." Mark sat down heavily in the chair by the window. His mind was reeling. "You were married, and you never told me." "I'm not married now. He's dead. He died 5 years ago." "How?" She hesitated. "A car accident." Mark's voice was hollow. "And Karim? What does he want?" "He blames me for what happened. He thinks it was my fault. He's been looking for me for years. I changed my name when I came to Canada, started over. I thought I was safe, but he found me 2 weeks ago. He's been following me, watching. Tonight was the first time he approached me directly." Mark stood, paced to the window. His wedding ring felt heavy on his finger. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" "I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of losing you. Of you thinking I was damaged, broken, a liar." "You are a liar, Samira. You've been lying to me since we met." She flinched. "I never lied about my feelings for you. That was real. That is real. How am I supposed to believe anything you say?" His voice cracked. I married you today. I married someone I don't even know. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. 3 sharp raps. They both froze. Mark looked at Samira. Her face had gone chalk white. Don't answer it, she whispered. The knock came again. Louder, more insistent. Mark crossed to the door, looked through the peephole. 2 uniformed police officers stood in the hallway. He opened the door. Can I help you? The older officer, a woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked past him into the room. We're looking for Samira Banani. Mark turned. Samira had stood, was backing toward the balcony doors. That's not her name, Mark said. Her name is Samira El-Fassi. The officer's expression didn't change. Sir, is there a woman by the name of Samira Banani in this room? Before Mark could answer, Samira spoke. Her voice was flat, defeated. I'm Samira Banani. The officer stepped into the room, her partner following. Ms. Banani, I need you to come with us. Why? Mark demanded. What's this about? The officer looked at him. There's been an incident. A man named Karim Banani was found deceased approximately 1 hour ago in an alley 6 blocks from this location. He'd been stabbed, and we have evidence that suggests Ms. Banani may have been involved. Mark felt the floor tilt beneath him. He looked at Samira. She was staring at the officers, her mouth slightly open, her face a mask of shock. That's impossible, she said. I've been here. I came back to the hotel. I've been with my husband. What time did you return to the hotel, ma'am? Samira looked at Mark. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. Around 3, she said, maybe a little before. And can anyone verify that? Mark found his voice. I can. She's been here, with me. The officer pulled out a notebook. Sir, what's your name? Mark Bergeron. I'm her husband. The partner, a younger man with a thick mustache, stepped forward. Mr. Acking. Bergeron, did you accompany your wife when she left the hotel earlier this evening? Mark hesitated. No, I was asleep. So you didn't see her leave or return? I woke up and she was gone. I went looking for her. I found her in the square near Notre Dame with Karim. They were arguing. The officers exchanged a glance. What time was this? Around 2:45, maybe 2:50. And then what happened? Karim left. We came back here. Did you see which direction he went? No, he just walked away. The older officer turned to Samira. Banani, what was the nature of your argument with the deceased? Samira's hands were shaking. He wanted me to come back to Morocco, to face his family. I told him I couldn't. I told him to leave me alone. Did the argument become physical? No, we just talked. Then my husband arrived and Karim left. That was it. And you came directly back to the hotel? A pause. Too long, yes. Miss Banani, the deceased, was found in an alley between Rue St. Paul and Rue de la Commune. That's on the direct route between the square and this hotel. The preliminary examination suggests he was killed between 2:55 and 3:10 a.m., and the murder weapon, a kitchen knife, was recovered near the body. It has fingerprints on it. Your fingerprints. The room went silent. Mark heard his own heartbeat in his ears. Samira was shaking her head. That's not possible. I didn't touch any knife. I didn't go near that alley. I came straight back here. We'll need you to come to the station to answer some questions. Am I being arrested? Not at this time. But you are a person of interest in an active homicide investigation. The officer's voice softened slightly. It would be better if you cooperated. Samira looked at Mark. He saw everything in her eyes. Fear, desperation, pleading. She was asking him to believe her, to trust her, to stand by her. He thought about the man in the square, the secrets she'd kept, the lies she'd told, the name she'd hidden, the life she'd never shared. He thought about their wedding vows, spoken just hours ago, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. He thought about the blood he'd imagined on white sheets, the vision from the beginning that hadn't happened yet. Or had it? He didn't know anymore what was real. Mark, she whispered. Please. The older officer took a step toward her. Ms. Banani, we need to go. Samira didn't move. Her eyes were still locked on Mark's, waiting for him to say something, to do something, to save her. But Mark stood frozen, his mind a chaos of confusion and betrayal and fear. And when the officer took Samira's arm and guided her toward the door, he didn't stop them, didn't speak. Just watched as his wife, still wearing her white nightgown, still wrapped in his jacket, was led away into the hallway. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and Mark was alone in the honeymoon suite, surrounded by rose petals and champagne glasses and the wreckage of a life he'd thought he understood. Mark didn't sleep. He sat in the chair by the window and watched the sky lighten from black to gray to pale blue. His phone sat on the armrest, silent. He'd called a lawyer at 4 in the morning, a criminal defense attorney his sister had recommended years ago when a colleague had gotten into trouble. The lawyer, a woman named Patricia Moreau, had listened to his frantic explanation and told him not to speak to the police again without representation. She'd meet Samira at the station. She'd handle it. But she'd also said something that lodged in Mark's chest like a splinter. Be prepared for this to get complicated. People aren't always who we think they are. At 7, Mark's phone finally rang. Patricia. Her voice was crisp, professional. Your wife has been formally arrested. They're charging her with second-degree murder. Mark's throat closed. He couldn't speak. The evidence is circumstantial but substantial, Patricia continued. The fingerprints on the weapon, the argument witnessed by you, the history between her and the victim. And there's more, Mark. Things you need to know. What things? Can you come to my office? I'd rather discuss this in person. An hour later, Mark sat across from Patricia in her downtown office, unshaven, still wearing his wedding suit. Patricia slid a folder across the desk. The police shared some of their findings with me, about Samira's past, about who she really is. Mark opened the folder. Inside were documents, official records, a marriage certificate from Casablanca dated 7 years ago, Samira Benani and Youssef Benani, a death certificate for Youssef, listing cause of death as blunt force trauma from a vehicular accident, a police report from the Casablanca Traffic Division, and then something else. Another police report, this one from 2 years before Youssef's death. A domestic disturbance call. Youssef had filed a complaint against Samira, claiming she'd attacked him during an argument. The complaint had been withdrawn the next day. Mark looked up. What is this? Patricia's expression was carefully neutral. It appears your wife's first marriage was troubled, possibly violent. The Moroccan authorities are sending more files, but the picture that's emerging is complicated. Youssef Benani was not a good man. There were allegations of abuse, control, financial manipulation. Samira tried to leave him multiple times. Each time, his family pressured her to return. In Morocco, especially in traditional families, divorce carries enormous stigma for women. Mark's head was spinning. So she was abused. That doesn't make her a murderer. No, but it establishes a pattern. A motive. The prosecution is going to argue that Samira has a history of violence in relationships, that when Karim confronted her, threatened to expose her past, she panicked and killed him to protect the new life she'd built. That's insane. She loved Youssef. She told me his death devastated her. Patricia leaned forward. Mark, did she tell you she loved him, or did you assume? The question hit him hard. He tried to remember. Samira had said Youssef died in an accident, that she'd been driving, that his family blamed her, but she'd never said she loved him, never said she mourned him. She'd only said she'd been hurt. There's something else, Patricia said quietly. She pulled out another document, a credit card statement. This was recovered from Karim Benani's hotel room. It shows he'd been in Montreal for 3 weeks. He checked into a hotel near your wife's apartment on June 1st. He'd been watching her, following her. The police found photographs in his room, hundreds of them. Samira leaving for work, Samira at the grocery store, Samira with you. Mark felt sick. Why didn't she tell me? Maybe she thought she could handle it. Maybe she was afraid of what you'd think if you knew the truth. Or maybe, Patricia paused, maybe there's more to this story than we know. The preliminary hearing was set for the following week. Samira was denied bail. Flight risk, the judge said. Previous history of fleeing the country. Mark attended the hearing, sat in the back of the courtroom, watched Samira stand before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked small, hollow. When her eyes found his, he saw a desperate hope flicker across her face. He looked away. After the hearing, Patricia pulled him aside. The prosecution is building their case. They're arguing premeditation. They say Samira knew Karim was in Montreal, that she lured him to that alley, that she brought the knife from the hotel kitchen. Did she? Mark asked. Patricia hesitated. The knife matches the set in the hotel's restaurant kitchen. It went missing sometime between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. The hotel has security footage showing someone in dark clothing entering the kitchen during that window. The footage is grainy, but the person's build is consistent with Samira's. Mark went home to his apartment, not the hotel, not Samira's place, his own space, which suddenly felt foreign and cold. He sat on his couch and opened his laptop. He needed to understand, needed to know who he'd married. He started searching Samira Banani, Youssef Banani, Casablanca. He found old news articles in French and Arabic, ran them through translation software. Most were about Youssef's death. Prominent businessman killed in tragic accident. Wife survives with minor injuries. But buried deeper, in smaller local news sites, were other stories. Allegations that Youssef had been involved in financial fraud, that his import-export business was a front for money laundering, that he had connections to organized crime. And there was one article, dated 6 months after his death, that mentioned Samira, wife of deceased businessman questioned in connection with missing funds. Investigation ongoing, no charges filed, then nothing. The trail went cold. Mark called Samira's mother. He'd spoken to her a few times over the past months, always briefly, always through Samira's phone. Now he dialed the number from the wedding guest list. An older woman's voice answered in Arabic. Mark struggled through in French. Madame Banani? This is Mark, Samira's husband. A long pause. I know who you are. Her accent was thick, her tone cold. I need to understand what happened. With Youssef. With Karim, please. You married my daughter and you know nothing about her. What kind of man does that? A man who loved her, who still loves her. The woman made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Love. That's what she told Youssef too, before she destroyed him. Mark's grip tightened on the phone. What are you talking about? My daughter is not the victim she pretends to be. Youssef tried to help her, gave her everything, and she repaid him with lies and theft and finally murder. Murder? You think she killed him? I know she did. The police couldn't prove it, but I know, and now she's done it again. Killed my youngest son, my baby. Karim only wanted justice, wanted her to confess, and she killed him for it. The line went dead. Mark sat in the silence of his apartment, the phone still pressed to his ear. He thought about Samira's face on their wedding day, the way she'd looked at him during their vows, the trembling in her hands when she'd slipped the ring on his finger. Had it all been a performance? Was everything a lie? Or was she trapped in a nightmare not of her making? He didn't know. Couldn't know. The trial began in late September. Mark attended every day, sitting in the same seat in the back row. The prosecution built their case methodically. They presented the fingerprints, the timeline, the history of violence. They brought in Samira's mother, who testified tearfully about her daughter's troubled marriage, her sudden disappearance after Youssef's death, the money that had vanished from Youssef's accounts. They presented evidence that Samira had transferred nearly $200,000 from Youssef's business to a private account in the weeks before his death, that she'd withdrawn it all in cash days after the funeral, that she'd used that money to pay for her new identity, her flight to Canada, her fresh start. The defense tried to counter. Patricia called witnesses who testified about Youssef's abuse, a former neighbor who'd heard screaming from their apartment, a doctor who'd treated Samira for a broken wrist she'd claimed came from a fall. But the prosecution had an answer for everything. Abuse victims don't usually steal money and flee the country. They don't usually change their names and build elaborate lies. They don't usually kill the family members who come looking for them. Samira didn't testify. Patricia advised against it, said the prosecution would tear her apart on cross-examination. So Mark never heard her version, never got to ask the questions that haunted him. Did you love me? Was any of it real? Who are you? On the 5th day of trial, the prosecution introduced new evidence. A witness, a hotel employee who'd seen Samira in the hallway at 2:40 a.m., returning to the suite. She'd been carrying something wrapped in a towel. She'd seemed agitated, distressed, had gone into the suite and emerged 10 minutes later without the bundle. Security footage corroborated the timing. The defense argued it proved nothing, but Mark could see the jury's faces, could see doubt hardening into certainty. The verdict came on a gray afternoon in early October. Guilty. Second-degree murder. Samira showed no reaction, just stared straight ahead as the judge read the sentence. 15 years to life. Possibility of parole after 10. Mark stood and walked out before the bailiffs took her away. He couldn't watch. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him. He pushed through without speaking, got into his car, drove. He didn't know where he was going, just drove through the city as the sun set and the streetlights came on. He ended up at the hotel Les Sans-Sulpice, the scene of his wedding night, the scene of the crime. He parked across the street and stared up at the window of the honeymoon suite. The light was on. Someone else was staying there now. Someone else's story was unfolding in that room. He wondered if they knew what had happened there, if the hotel told guests, if the room was haunted. His phone buzzed. A message from Patricia. Samira wants to see you. Visitation tomorrow at 2. Mark deleted the message. He'd made his decision during the trial. During the weeks of revelations and lies and half-truths, he couldn't save her, couldn't even understand her. And he couldn't spend his life trying to untangle what was real from what was performance. He'd loved a woman who didn't exist, or who existed only in fragments, in the spaces between her lies. And that woman was gone now, locked away, maybe forever. A week later, the annulment papers arrived. Samira had filed from prison. The marriage had lasted less than 24 hours. Under Quebec law, given the circumstances, it could be dissolved as if it had never happened. Mark signed without reading, sent them back, tried to return to his life. But his life had a hole in it now. A Samira-shaped absence. His sister tried to help, invited him for dinner, introduced him to friends. But Mark couldn't connect, couldn't trust. Every woman he met, he wondered, what are you hiding? What don't I know? Who are you really? Months passed. Winter came. Mark worked, ate, went through the motions. One evening in January, he was cleaning out a closet and found a box, Samira's things, items she'd left at his apartment, books, a scarf, a pair of earrings. And at the bottom, a photograph, old not faded. A young Samira, maybe 19 or 20, standing in front of the ocean. Morocco, probably. She was smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile that couldn't be faked, and written on the back, in careful handwriting, a single line in Arabic. He used his phone to translate it. I was happy once. Mark stared at the words. Thought about the woman he'd married, the woman who'd killed, the woman who'd loved him, or pretended to, or maybe genuinely tried. He thought about the layers of trauma and survival and desperation that had built the person Samira had become. He thought about Yusuf and Karim and the weight of a past that couldn't be escaped. And he thought about himself, about how easily he'd believed, how willingly he'd accepted the version of Samira she'd wanted him to see, how badly he'd wanted to be the one who saved her, fixed her, made her whole. But people couldn't be saved by love alone. Sometimes the damage was too deep, the lies too tangled, the past too heavy. Sometimes the woman you married on a perfect June day was a stranger, and sometimes the stranger was a killer, and sometimes you never really knew which was true. Mark put the photograph back in the box, closed it, put it on a shelf in the back of the closet. He didn't throw it away. Couldn't quite do that, but he didn't look at it again either. He built his life on the belief that people were fundamentally noble, that honesty and trust in time could reveal anyone's true self. Samira had taught him otherwise, had shown him that some people were mysteries even to themselves, that some truths were too painful to speak, that some pasts couldn't be outrun. That love, however genuine, wasn't always enough. 6 months later, Mark received a letter, prison stationery, Samira's handwriting. He almost threw it away unopened. But something stopped him. He sat down, opened it, read. The letter was short. She didn't protest her innocence, didn't explain or justify or beg. She simply said she was sorry. Sorry for the lies, sorry for the pain, sorry for dragging him into a story that was never his to carry. She said she'd loved him, not the way he deserved, not honestly or fully, but in the only way she'd been capable of at the time. She said she hoped someday he'd find someone he could trust completely, someone with no shadows, no secrets, no blood on her hands. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, didn't deserve it, but she wanted him to know that the happiness she'd felt with him, brief as it was, had been real. The only real happiness she'd known in years. She signed it simply. Samira, not Banani, not El-Fassi. Just Samira. DeMarc read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the box with the photograph. He didn't write back, didn't visit, didn't try to maintain contact, but he kept the letter, kept the box, because despite everything, despite the trial and the verdict and the ruins of his trust, he needed to believe that some part of what they'd shared had been true. That for a few brief months, he'd known a woman who'd tried, however imperfectly, to be someone better than her past. And that woman, whoever she really was, had loved him, or tried to. And in the end, maybe trying was all anyone could do. Maybe we were all just fragments, all mysteries, all carrying past we couldn't quite escape. And maybe the tragedy wasn't that Samira had lied. Maybe the tragedy was that she'd told him as much truth as she could, and it still hadn't been enough. Mark stood in his apartment as snow began to fall outside. He looked at his left hand. The wedding ring was gone, removed weeks ago. But the pale line where it had been remained, a ghost of a promise. A scar from a day that felt like a lifetime ago. He thought about Samira in her cell, thought about Kareem in the ground, thought about Yusuf and the accident that maybe wasn't an accident, thought about all the small choices and desperate moments that had led to a knife in an alley on a wedding night. And he thought about himself, about how he'd move forward from this, how he'd learn to trust again. If he'd learned to trust again, the snow fell harder. The city disappeared behind a veil of white. And Mark turned away from the window, away from the past, and tried to imagine a future where love didn't end in courtrooms and prison cells and unanswered questions. A future where the woman who said "I do" actually meant it, where secrets stayed buried because there were no secrets to bury, where wedding nights ended with joy instead of sirens and blood and strangers in orange jumpsuits. He didn't know if such a future existed, but he had to believe it did, because the alternative was unbearable. The alternative was a world where everyone was Samira, where everyone was hiding, where trust was just another word for willful blindness. And Mark couldn't live in that world, wouldn't. So he chose to believe, chose to hope, chose to think that somewhere, somehow, there was a love without shadows. And maybe someday he'd find it, but not today. Today he would simply survive, would put one foot in front of the other, would carry the weight of what he'd learned. About Samira, about himself, about the thin line between the person we love and the stranger we married. And that would have to be enough.